of San Jose. Okay, so today we're going to get into an update. We've got an update from Kip on just the standard EOC update on stage 7 and where we're at. We'll have Kelly give an update on city services, the city services that we have in motion and our plan for moving forward with additional city services. And then Benna and Jackie will give a quick update on state and federal action on evictions. And then Carolina will give an update on strategic communications plan for at-risk communities. So I'm going to pass it off to Kip.
Thank you, Dave. Kip Harkness, Deputy City Manager and Emergency Operations Center Director. As Dave mentioned, just a quick update on where we are. It's now been 243 days since we initiated our pandemic response here in the city. And we have, as a nation, just passed the grim milestone of 200,000 deaths nationally, and an all too painful 297 deaths locally, with 109 patients struggling with COVID-19 in local hospitals as we speak. Continued high unemployment, economic distress, all of which are, of course, disproportionately impacting our Black, Latinx, and Native Americans as individuals and communities, both across the nation and here in San Jose specifically. Within the new California Blueprint for a Safe Economy, Santa Clara County is at this moment still in Tier 2, that red tier, indicating a continued substantial risk level, but allowing for the opening of a wider range of businesses than was possible during the full shelter in place. There are 21 days, as a reminder, in between changes in levels, so it'll be a while for us before we transition to the next, assuming that we're able to get within the next thresholds. And we're fairly close on many of the numbers, but we need to stay there for an extended period of time. So within the city's context, that puts us now at stage 7, and we've realigned our own pandemic plan so that it is both color and stage aligned with the state tiers, so there'll be at least a little bit less confusion on where we are and where we aren't. This stage 7 allows us to continue our reopening process, which you'll hear more about in greater detail from Kelly later in the presentation. From the EOC, since we last updated you, our work continues to slow and reduce the spread of COVID-19 and support our most vulnerable, including a few highlights: coordinated and distributed a continuing 2.3 million meals a week with no reported gaps. Our Burnell Emergency Interim Housing site has come online. There are currently about 31 people there, with folks moving in daily. Ultimately, 78 folks will be living in that site, and then 2 other sites, this first site for singles, the additional site for couples, and then families at Evans Lane and Rue Ferrari will add a total of 200 beds to the emergency interim housing. I was actually out at the site recently, and it's a really, really well done site if you haven't had a chance to go out and visit. We have now opened a total of 8 PRNS pod sites as childcare facilities and school day support, and we'll be preparing to scale that up to as many as 24, depending on enrollment and demand. During the periods of poor air quality due to the wildfire smoke, more than a week ago, we opened experimentally a couple of clean air centers, providing PPE and supplies to those who needed a break and some fresh air, quite literally, and have refined the protocols and procedures around that so that we will have that in place going forward. We finalized and sent out a Greater Downtown Economic Recovery Task Force comment letter to state officials and continue to be actively engaged in advocating from San Jose on the potential for a 4th stimulus package at the federal level, should there ever be federal action. In addition, you'll hear today more about the Coronavirus Relief Fund for local assistance and our Community and Economic Recovery Branch, in addition to the cash assistance that you'll hear more detail about, has worked with San Jose Clean Energy to develop a framework for an electrical bill relief program for people who are members of San Jose Clean Energy. We've provided several thousand copies of our local assistance trifold brochures in multiple languages for distribution by the county's business empowerment team. We've also coordinated with the county on public health order compliance via integration with the county's compliance task force. Currently, the county has been handling the vast majority of complaints and concerns. Finally, our virtual meeting engagement team continues to train employees around the city on how to conduct virtual community meetings. So far, we've conducted 11 trainees and trained over 160 city employees. We are also partnering with the city clerk to develop a citywide virtual community meeting calendar so that people can be involved in the decisions that affect their lives. So let's dive right into city services update with Kelly Parley, the Assistant Director of Human Resources, who's been leading our Powered by People 2.0 task force as its director, which you heard about the overall effort last time. We'll dive a little bit in greater depth into the opening up of services. Sort of as a preface to this, I have three framing comments before turning it over to Kelly and team. One is, as we've looked at the data, we realized we've never really stopped. Two is that it's not easy to reopen services. And three is that we're still in a public health emergency. So while we're talking about reopening services, the reality is most of our work actually never stopped. Some highly visible services, such as parking enforcement, were suspended, but the core work of the city continued, if unseen, from the sewer cleaning, as was highlighted in 3.1, to recycle pickup and everything in between. For the most part, when you look at the numbers of employees, we either continued providing essential services in a different way, or were redeployed to the emergency response and new services like feeding the hungry. Second point, as we seek to reopen the services we did shut down, we are finding that resuming services is a lot harder than simply stopping them. Even if you figure out what works for the individual service, it may not work for related or adjacent services. It's sort of like trying to figure out one side of a Rubik's Cube, and solving for the color red won't allow you to solve for the other sides. As an example, we now have significant new constraints on buildings and facilities with social distancing requirements that we didn't have to worry about before. For example, elevator capacity in multi-story buildings such as City Hall is now almost always the critical bottleneck in how many people we can return to work effectively in that location. And so we have to balance out one service against the other and not simply take into account, can we open this service by itself? And then finally, third point is we do continue to be in this public health emergency, and there is still substantial risk, as indicated by the tier that we're in, and we need to meet our responsibility to keep both our workforce and the public safe, all of which involve looking at all of these services together rather than individually. Kelly's going to walk you through our current plan and the team's work on this in much more detail, so I'll pass it over to her. Kelly?
Thank you, Kip. Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. Kelly Parley, Assistant Director for HR, and also leading the Powered by People 2.0 team out of the EOC. Just to give you a little preview of where I'm going with the update, I just want to connect how this expansion and reopening of services is related to a prior presentation I gave around Powered by People 2.0. I'll give you a bit of a timeline going back to shelter in place up to present in terms of what we've done with expansion and reopening of services. And then talk a little bit about what it takes to create a safe workplace in terms of people and process, and then just a little bit about kind of what's next in terms of stage 7 and beyond. You can go to the next slide, Kip. So if we can jump right to the circle. This may be familiar to you from my last presentation, but I think it's worth putting forward again. Priority number 1 is a safe workplace, and that includes employees and the public as we have more services expand or reopen. 2 major pillars supporting a safe workplace are effective teams and how do we manage that in predominantly remote environment, but also teams who are working in the field and in city spaces. And then how do we use opportunities and innovations around Drive to Digital to also support that? And then all of the items around the circle give a sense of all the things that we're thinking about in terms of supporting a safe workplace and also being able to plan and support for the expansion and reopening of services. And from that work, if you go to the next slide, we came up with 4 objectives. Oh, sorry, I forgot about the teams. In order to do this response to recovery, that meant for those 4 objectives, we launched 4 teams, and there are more folks behind those, but also created a governance structure in which we could vet and share with folks what we were doing and things that we were struggling with. And so the next slide shows the 4 objectives, and the one I want to focus on is safe workplace, because the safe workplace team is handling a whole lot in order to support both the reopening and expansion of services, but also planning to get ahead, to try to get ahead of the curve in terms of putting both facilities and safety protocols in place. So we'll focus on that for now. I want to go back in time. Next slide. And we can go right to the timeline. So back March 17th with shelter in place, prior to shelter in place, each of the departments submitted something called a continuity of services plan, or something we affectionately in the Emergency Operations Center call COOPS. From the collection of information from those departments, and in addition to that, vetting things with EOC leadership, we identified about 265 city services. Those I just want to say in terms of city services for clarification are a range of things, everything from programs to administrative functions to some of the more visible broad city services that Kip mentioned. But as we moved about 2,400 full-time employees almost overnight, we were able to sustain many of what we had previously identified as non-essential services, which is a bit of a misnomer. And we're able to continue to provide many city services, up to almost about 75% of our services, in the combination of folks working remotely or in the field or in a city space. In addition to that, from the roadmap, as many of you already know, we launched 9 new EOC services. And again, those are of different size and scope. So as we moved into further into stage 5, into April, May, and June, on the next slide, in this period of time, we were able to learn a lot, both in terms of science, guidance from the county, best practices. The safety team spent a lot of time researching and using consulting support about what we could do and how we needed to do it. And while it was a bit of a messy time for folks in terms of what are the best practices for codes of safe practice and what do we need to do from a facilities perspective, I couldn't believe the number of conversations around which piece of plexiglass to use and which was most appropriate for an environment. But in the process of doing that and learning more, 12 city services were reopened for expansion, and you can see those identified to the left. And again, they vary in grain size in terms of scope and depth. We were able to open or expand in many instances 12 more. And at that point in time, we'd stood up another service in the EOC related to childcare and summer camps. That doesn't mean that they were fully deployed or implemented, but we began thinking and planning for those. In addition to that, I think it's notable that almost 600 employees have been reassigned to the EOC, and that includes in the leadership branch as well as the folks working out in the field. So that was a lot in April, May, and June. So if we go into stage 6, we begin to also put a lot more in place to be able to feel comfortable and confident in safety practices and facilities modifications. In this case, we reopened or expanded 13 more city services. The EOC worked on digital inclusion and a lot of activity around Beautify San Jose. A couple of things of note, the police administration building, the police communication building, I'll just note were a lot of work in terms of making sure that that could be modified and the right safety practices put in place. But we were also dealing with how do we do a little bit more with animal care and rabies vaccinations, for example. We also, the learning pods were coming online in terms of planning. And I learned from that experience that while we had potentially used the same locations for childcare or summer camps, there was a lot of modification or at least consideration around how you would then redeploy learning pods in those potentially same locations. So it causes a lot for the safety and facilities team to be able to retool sites when new services are open. It's not necessarily business as usual. By this time, the EOC staffing is at about 300 folks. So as we get into September here more recently, and in stage 7, we recently expanded or reopened an additional 7 city services, and you can see those listed there. In particular, we had to pivot pretty quickly in order to do some real strong support for the census. Canvassing, kiosks, and tabling also required a lot in terms of what are the right practices and code of safe practices to do that? How do we assess that? And then how do we make sure that folks have the right personal protective equipment and are prepared to do that work? And you can see other ones listed there. So that's what we've accomplished thus far in terms of from shelter in place to where we're at right now. So just describe for you just a little bit about what it takes and what we've learned. I want to share a little bit about process and people. We've learned a lot and put a lot in place in the last couple of months when it comes to that. If you go to the next slide, there's 5 major things I would point out in terms of timing. So the departments back prior to March had submitted these COOPs, or continuity of operations plans. Again in May, we asked them to submit another round of those, but this time tooled toward what are your priorities for expansion and reopening of services. Those were relatively elaborate plans. I took a look at each and every one of them. a lot of work by the departments. Around June 1st, we commissioned the EOC Powered by People team, which was not only focused on this, but also how do we think about the workforce going forward for the next year or so. By mid-June, we went after those submissions from the departments and met with each of the departments to hear from them about what their priorities were in terms of expanding and reopening, as well as some of the challenges that they might be facing and other issues that we might have to deal with, like can somebody stay remote or can somebody return to remote if we're able to find laptops? So all kinds of conversations happened with the departments at that point in time, and we learned a lot from talking with them. By the end of June, we had established an initial EOC request and review process for opening or re-expanding services. This was important because of all of the things that Kip mentioned. There may be things that seemed viable to open, but if there wasn't a broader perspective from an EOC executive leadership team, you could end up with services reopening and colliding with others, or maybe not enough safety or facilities folks to do both at the same time. So we did that and started every other week meeting with the EOC executive leadership team. I would bring them requests from the departments and we would vet and discuss and deliberate and review, and then come back to the safety and facilities team and ask them to do a formal assessment. We went back in August to refine the process, make sure we had the right tools for the departments. We were clear about the process. I mean, you can imagine, given the size and range of our departments, it's difficult to get the process communicated down through the organization. And everybody was working a lot, so we redid that, and we have a pretty well-oiled machine at the moment in terms of being able to elicit those requests, make sure we're responding in the right way with safety and facilities, and also vetting those appropriately, not only with the EOC leadership, but the city manager leadership. So a little bit more about what it takes in terms of people. This work is a heavy lift, and I want to honor and acknowledge our safety and facilities folks. On the safety side, folks are putting in, and you all are aware of some of the basic practices around face coverings and hand washing and social distancing. But for every single opportunity we have to expand and reopen, we're having to look at individual positions in some instances, and they develop codes of safe practice. On the other hand, we then have the facilities folks who are going out and making sure that the physical workplace can support the behavioral things and in terms of what the health and safety folks are putting together. And so it's a partnership, and it's been an amazing partnership. I watched them grow and I watched them work more strategically over the last few months. Just to acknowledge that team, there's a team of 30 plus folks from safety and facilities, most of whom have been in the EOC for a very long period of time, and have given their time, talent, energy, and commitment, and significant devotion to making sure that we can create the best and safest workplace possible, both physical as well as behavioral practices. So I want to acknowledge them here. They're a talented group of folks that I would never have thought as an assistant director for HR I would be spending this much time with and have learned so much from. So in terms of building safe spaces, again, I want to offer up a few things. There's 30 plus team members on the safety and facility side. In addition to that, we have tapped 38 department safety liaisons. So we've asked folks in each department to identify somebody as a safety liaison who can be a resource to departments, who can be a conduit and a hub for communication. When we recognize that supervisors weren't aware of a lot of the practices and policies, hats off to Joe Gregory and Sarah Steele, who trained over 500 supervisors in a very short period of time on what was happening, because so much had been happening so quickly. Safety protocols, establishing 20 plus safety protocols. I want to make a note here that they're basic codes of safe practice, and then often have to be modified or remodified based on the very specific ask that's happening. Launched a really cool safety toolkit, again, a resource for departments and safety liaisons, and trained them on that. Performed about 30 facility safety assessments, and these are in partnership between safety and facilities, again, signing off in a very specific way that we're confident that we put the best things in place. In terms of physical improvements, about 9 of the 50 community centers have had physical improvements. Those continue to evolve and move on a daily basis. 12 of 23 Library Express pickup locations have been had physical improvements to them. 18 of the 18 floors in City Hall have had improvements done. About 95% of the ones that need to be completed are completed. 2 of the yards have had physical improvements, and then we've had 4 other facilities: airport, regional wastewater facility, the police administration and communications building. So they've been hard at work. and a lot more to go, and constantly trying to respond in the moment, at the same time trying to get ahead. We've been focused on how to prioritize, how to get ahead of the game in terms of preparing to have spaces ready. So in terms of facilities, common area safety improvement, so there's two aspects to this, at least from a facilities perspective. One is the common and shared areas. And while some of those vary a bit, in particular, most of us are familiar with City Hall, each floor is slightly different. It gets a little bit more interesting as you move out into community spaces in terms of how you do common area improvements, but it's a wide range of things. Touchless fixtures, if you've been in, you've noticed many of those. Bagging the drinking fountains, making signage and floor markings in break rooms, elevators and signage, the lobby spaces, stairwells and floor markings, office ways, aisleways actually have floor markings in them now, and then entryways we're doing health screening and signage. So a lot of work just to get, from a physical perspective, a common area safe. The second one is when we do return or reopen a service that involves bringing employees back into a space, there's a very specific assessment that occurs. And so it's not, if any floor of the 18th floors or of the 18 floors in City Hall are pretty different. So when an employee or a group of employees are about to return to a space or need to, and we did a good example is of the second floor, a very particular assessment has to come in. And so you're looking at furniture, you're looking at equipment like PPE distribution, how much of it is needed. Floor markings, again, very specific and tailored to that office space. Wireless doorbells, workstations, partitioning, particularly plexiglass partitions, and where do you put those? How many of you put them? Do you do them tall? Do you do them short? And then exterior signage, pretty common for any sort of working space for employees. So I wanted to call this wash, rinse, and repeat because I think one of the biggest learnings for all of us as we particularly have moved into doing more, bringing more back online, or retooling spaces for an additional or an alternative service. I think a good example is the childcare and summer camps to learning pods, is that it's not a static process. It's not a one and done activity. It's something where when something changes, safety and facilities has to go back out and make sure and ensure that that space, it doesn't need to be altered in another way. Do we need to have a different code of safe practice given what people are doing functionally? So I think that's the biggest learning for me, but also we talk about it a lot as a team, is how do we make sure that we're, however things are changing, that we're keeping up with them. So in terms of stage 7 and beyond, there are a few things, very particular things we're looking at and working on at the moment. And then I think the big thing is the process that we've put in place. So City Hall, in terms of the first floor, we've initiated a first floor review and assessment for public access. We're well aware that there's a large segment of our potential population who cannot do things related to first floor services, and that we have to be prepared to potentially bring the public back in. And it's a complicated one, but they're working on it as we speak. We've been working with PRNS in terms of Happy Hollow Park and Zoo. As Kip mentioned, up to 24 learning pods. That will require a fair amount of expansion if we have that demand to do that. There's a series of Wi-Fi access events going on in terms of digital inclusion. And one that's interesting for us in HR is that throughout the hiring process, there are certain activities where it's actually merited and we need to bring folks in to a City Hall space in order to accomplish the hiring process. So that's an ongoing activity. We've seen more activity of late. I think the big thing for going forward is, again, the process that I mentioned. On a 2-week cadence, we're using an executive team to review the process for expanding or reopening services. We accommodate things in between for sure, but making sure that we have a sound process in place and that we can feel really confident that we've got the right safety practices and facility modifications in place as well. So with that, Kip, I don't know if you want to add anything in conclusion, but that's what I've got.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, team. I think in conclusion, I just first want to extend enormous thanks to Kelly and all of the staff who've been working tirelessly to help us resume services. In many cases, pulling double duty with other work, either in the EOC or their normal roles. I think at this point, you know, one of the primary bottlenecks on what we can do now that we've figured out how to do things safely is the people to do them. And so I throw up this slide with the parts, an extended roadmap of what we're doing in the Emergency Operations Center. Kelly kind of took you through the build of the different services that we've added in the Emergency Operations Center from really January to today. Here you see a visual of those. The ones that are outlined in yellowish orange, which is most of them, are new services for the city that we had not been doing before. And so all of these services have a team behind them. All of these services are powered by people. And I think at this point, our biggest constraint in continuing to open up services is really making sure that we have the people that we need to do the emergency response and recovery work, as well as provide those services. But I believe that Kelly and her crew, the safety team and the facilities team in particular, have really come up with a methodology that makes sure that our workers are safe and that the public is safe when they're interacting with our workers. And I'm very proud of that work. And we will continue to push to reopen more and more services, realizing that we have this inherent tension between continuing our emergency response and the reopening. So with that, I think we're moving to our next item, which is an update on state and federal action on evictions. And we'll hear first from Benna Chang, our Director of Intergovernmental Relations, and then from Jackie Morales-Ferrand, our Director of Housing. Benna, I believe it's you.
Great, thank you so much, Kip. So Benna, I'm the Director of Intergovernmental Relations for the City of San Jose, and here just to give a quick update on both state and federal actions around evictions. So on the state side, on August 31st, the governor signed AB 3088. As an urgency bill, AB 3088 took effect immediately. The bill was the result of a lot of negotiations between landlords, banks, and tenants, and it primarily allows additional time for renters to pay rent if they're negatively impacted by COVID. It's important to also note that the state did not end up taking action on commercial evictions. As a city, we've continued to express to the governor and to GoBiz the importance of commercial protections and the impact of the commercial eviction moratorium on the city of San Jose. On the federal side, on August 8th, the president issued an executive order that directed the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, to look at preventing residential evictions. And subsequently, the CDC took action through an order that halts evictions for people who can demonstrate that they have lost substantial income and are making best efforts to pay. Nationally, many advocacy organizations are calling for financial rental assistance to go along with the CDC's actions. Unfortunately, Congress is at a standstill in terms of negotiations on a fourth stimulus package right now. There's been a lot of back and forth and different proposals from different caucuses and from the Republicans and the Democrats. But however, negotiations have really stalled, and we don't anticipate that any action will be taking place before the election. So with that, I wanted to pass it on to Jackie to talk about a little bit more detail of these two actions.
Thank you. On August 31st, the governor signed the Tenant Relief Act. The act provides eviction protections for rent owed between March 1st through January 31st, 2021. This protection applies to those who cannot pay rent due to COVID-19. The law applies to all residential tenants, including tenants living in single-family homes, duplexes, apartments, and mobile home tenants as well. And as Benna already mentioned, commercial tenants are not covered by this legislation. Under the law, eviction proceedings can begin on October 5th for non-COVID-19 protected tenants. City of San Jose residents are subject to San Jose's period to pay March through August rent. Under San Jose's ordinance, tenants must pay 50% of their rent within 6 months of September 1st by February 28th, 2021, and tenants have until August 31st, 2021 to pay the entire March through August 2020 rent balance. The Tenant Relief Act prohibits any further local legislation affecting rent between March 1st through January 31st, 2021. For this reason, the Housing Department will not be returning next week with additional actions for your consideration because of this prohibition. On September 2nd, the CDC issued its own order placing a moratorium on evictions through December 31st, 2020 in an effort to prevent the spread of COVID-19. The CDC order states that it does not apply in any state with a moratorium on residential evictions that provides the same or greater level of public health protection than the requirements listed in this order. When comparing the federal order with the states, The state appears to provide a greater level of protection because it would not require 100% of the rent to become due by January 1st. Next slide. The Tenant Relief Act protects tenants from evictions for unpaid COVID-19 rent debt if tenants meet certain conditions. COVID-19 rent debt is unpaid rent or any other unpaid financial obligation of a tenant under the tenancy that came due during the time period of protection. The time period covered by the Act is between March 2020 through January 2021. For rent owed between March through August 2020, tenants cannot be evicted if they provided their landlord with a declaration of COVID-19 related financial distress within 15 days of receiving a notice of failure to pay rent. So this declaration is extremely important in protecting the tenants. For rent owed between September 2020 through January 2021, tenants cannot be evicted if they provide their landlord with a declaration and pay 25% of their rent owed between this time no later than January 31st, 2020. When a landlord serves a notice for non-payment of rent, they have to provide tenants with 15 days to return the declaration. The landlord must provide an unsigned copy of this declaration to the tenant when they serve the non-payment of rent notice. The 15-day time limit for the tenant to sign and return the declaration of COVID-19 related financial distress starts the day after the notice is personally delivered to tenants and ends 15 business days later, excluding weekends and holidays. So as you can see, there is quite a procedure that has to be followed, and the housing department, the state, we just got a great tool from United Way, are trying to push out consistent information about what tenants need to do in order to protect their rights.
Thank you, Jackie. Now we're going to go in for a deep dive into our strategic communications plan, which focuses on those most at risk, our most vulnerable communities, and non-English speakers. And for that, we're going to bring forward our twin emergency public information officers, Carolina Camarena and Colin Haney, to walk us through their work and the work of their team. Carolina, Colin?
Thank you. Thank you, Kip. Carolina Camarena. I am the co-lead alongside with my colleague Colin Hain, and my day job is the Public Information Manager for the Department of Parks, Recreation, and Neighborhood Services. And before I dive into presenting the EOC Communication Strategic Plan for our most vulnerable communities, I want to just do a little bit of a recap of what the EPIO has done thus far. A lot of the information is on the slide, but I'm going to highlight 3 of the tactics. We have produced close to 40 social media influencer videos. It's important that our communities can resonate with the information that we are placing. And so here you will see a member of Los Tigres del Norte. Los Tigres del Norte are a local band. They're multi-Grammy Award winners. And for our Spanish-speaking community, they're like the Rolling Stones. Big deal in our own city. So in addition to Los Tigres del Norte, we had other culturally appropriate social media influencers, again, for a total of just under 40, and we did that in 5 different languages. You're all aware with the flash reports, we've sent out about 140 of them, and while the majority of them are COVID related, I think it's important to note that we've had other emergencies during this pandemic, including the rolling blackouts, and most recently, the wildfires. And then lastly, I want to just spend a little bit of time with the behavioral messaging. So previously, that was an omni-channel approach meant to reach the masses. And the messages that were chosen were informed by data, and they were researched on their effectiveness on memory retention. Next slide, Kip. So now that we've talked about the past, I want to talk a little bit about the present and the future. We have developed a very robust strategic communications plan focused on reaching our most at-risk communities and non-English speakers. The plan aligns with the goals and priorities of the EOC roadmap through the epidemic. It outlines strategies focused again on our hardest to reach communities, along with the general population. Santa Clara County Public Health data was used to inform the strategies, In addition to our city's annual report and a new American economy report produced alongside our Office of Immigrant Affairs, which really highlighted the need for language access. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the approach of the plan. And yes, I will be repeating a bit of what I've already said, but it's important to repeat that we are prioritizing the most vulnerable to COVID-19 and its effects. Residents and businesses who are less connected to our City of San Jose communication channels and services, our low-income residents, and our non-English speakers, our monolingual non-English speakers. By prioritizing these communities, we are delivering vital information and resources to those who need it the most, and community members who are already aware of our city communication channels and empowered to access our resources will still easily find and benefit from our communication efforts. The plan is a living document and it will evolve to meet the needs of our community. A few weeks ago, we received data that again highlighted the need to reach residents who live in apartments, multifamily dwellings, or shared spaces. And we are keeping a eye on zip code 95117. Okay, so this would be slide 3. What is it that we want to communicate? Well, to our residents, there are 4 main messages. And in a nutshell, it's get tested. So free testing is available. Supported isolation services are available. We want to make sure that they know what resources are available through our virtual local assistance center, and we'll continue to talk about staying safe, wearing your mask, washing your hands, and maintaining social distance. For our business community, we want 3 main messages: resources that are available to them through the virtual local assistance and other resources. We want them to understand that testing is the path to reopening, and we want them to encourage their employees to get tested. And lastly, we'll continue to promote new state and county health orders as they impact our business community. Next slide, please, Skip. Okay. So community-based social marketing strategies are the foundation of this plan. They've proven very, very effective in changing behavior or helping people adopt new behavior. You see the word prompts up here, and prompts is just a really fancy marketing term for reminders. So you're at the grocery store and you've got food on your mind already, you've got your shopping cart, and you're going to see an ad that is going to remind you to take a test. It's free, but we'll also let you know that we have food resources available through our Food and Distribution Necessities branch, as well as our community partners. You'll see other things like tent cards if you're dining al fresco. You're at a table, there will be a tent card that will tell you wear your mask and again, get tested. Another strategy is what they call social norms. We as humans are likely to do what our role models do, and we've already been employing the tactic of social media influencers. We're going to do some advertisements. We want to advertise in all our ethnic media, that's print, radio, and TV. We also want to advertise on YouTube and Facebook and a few other social media channels. Then of course, we're going to continue to amplify all this information on our digital media platforms, the city website, the social media, and that's where the masses will get the information as well. We are in and moving to the recovery phase. We are working with our community and economic recovery branch and working with our community-based and nonprofit partners to ensure that they have the resources they need to help amplify these messages to our residents. And the same for our neighborhood business districts and ethnic chambers. We want to work with them as well so that they are empowered and have the information they have to provide the information to small businesses. And then lastly, we want to partner with you all. We need your help. We would like you to help us identify critical business areas, and we'd like you to help us promote these messages to your residents and your businesses. So a little bit of homework for you all. You will be hearing from the EPIO branch. And with that, I conclude the presentation. Kip.
Thank you, Carolina and Colin and your team for all the great work you've done, especially stepping in so quickly and building out this, this great plan. I want to close this section, our 3.1, by highlighting two of our amazing partners in this case. Emergency management is a team sport, and we don't do this alone, and we do this with partners. And in this case, the partners that I want to highlight are those who've been really related to the actions around evictions that you heard Jackie and Benna talk about. I want to highlight both the Law Foundation and the County Office of Supportive Housing. They've set up innovative new approaches to helping tenants and landlords work through potential eviction issues. And as a result, we recognize them here. The Law Foundation has developed a collaborative court, which is this pretrial forum that resolves issues prior to going to a superior court. They've conducted outreach to educate the community on the various, as you can see, complicated eviction moratoriums at the city, county, state, and federal level. And they offer free legal information and counseling to the entire rental community. The County of Santa Clara, specifically the County Office of Supportive Housing, has been an excellent partner. They've implemented a housing mediation program. They offer no-cost mediation for tenants and property owners seeking to resolve disputes without going to court. And they have a critical focus on reducing evictions and deploying a viable repayment plan to help people figure out how they can get that cash flow back in, which is also so critical for those small landlords in particular. And they have this common goal of helping each party maintain a healthy rental agreement in the middle of this horrible pandemic. So we close by recognizing these two partners who are doing great work in terms of supporting the eviction moratorium and allowing people to continue to have a place to live. And with that, City Manager Dave Sykes, I turn it back over to you in conclusion.
Yeah, thank you, Kip, and thank you, team. And Mayor, that concludes our presentation for 3.1.